Well, hello again. It has been an honor and a privilege to be able to teach you in the last two sessions about a biblical worldview and the theological understanding of origins. Now let's get into a little bit more of other worldviews and some science. So again, the existential questions are of origins, where do we come from, of not just origins but also meaning. Why am I here? Questions of ethics or morality, which is what should we do, and then questions of destiny. Now, we are not the first generation to have these questions. It has been part of human history. About 3,400 years ago, a group of Hebrews were coming out of a long time of slavery under the Egyptians, and they also had a lot of questions to form a worldview, and they had been raised in paganism with the Egyptians, and out in the desert, God is going to contact them, reveal himself to them with his word, special revelation, and they also had those same questions, and God is going to form a worldview in them. And this worldview is in contrast to what they had heard, probably, where they are from. And today, we also have a worldview that is taught around us, like we have already seen, naturalism that is based on atheism with some foundational categories or premises. One, that nature or matter is all that exists. Number two, everything can and should be explained by time plus chance plus the laws of nature working on matter. Carl Sagan, the astrophysicist, is the one who coined this naturalistic term. The cosmos is all that is, all that ever was, and all that will ever be. So on speaking of origins, we need to understand that it is not about science versus religion. It is about really religion versus religion. The rationalist of the 21st century believes in the beginning, to answer the question of origins, in the beginning, nothing created. The Bible says, in the beginning, God created. It is not a religion versus science. Again, it is really a worldview versus a worldview, or religion versus religion. So, from a naturalistic perspective, how do they answer where do we come from? Now remember, the way you answer this question will dictate the logical way that the rest of the questions will be answered. So today we have evidence in the present, and when a naturalist wants to know the origin of what we see today in the present, again with empirical science, with observational science, we can't do that directly. So they have come up with a model of origins. Many today know this model as the Big Bang or cosmic inflation. So how does this model of origins begin? It begins with, in the beginning, there was nothing. And then the nothing produced a quantum singularity. it's a hypothetical point that they believe came into existence about 13.8 to 14 billion years ago. It supposedly contained all the mass of the universe in a small point, and it had a rapid expansion. And then as it is expanding, we have the formation, they believe, of the first elements, which were the lighter elements: hydrogen, helium, lithium. And these elements, they believed, somehow formed clouds. And these element clouds somehow collapsed on themselves to form the first stars. Now, this is a lot of hypotheses and theories. Nobody really knows. Even Neil deGrasse Tyson, the Cosmos series that came out, the new one in 2014, that he is either agnostic or atheist. He says the following:
Se nenhum de nós soubesse de antemão que as estrelas existem, a pesquisa da linha de frente ofereceria muitas razões convincentes pelas quais as estrelas nunca poderiam se formar.
So what he is really saying here is that what he knows of astrophysics, it is really difficult to come up with a model that can explain star formation without a creator by purely naturalistic processes. But somehow they came along. And then after these lighter element stars, which are hypothetical because we don't see any today, they're called population 3 stars. Later there were supernovas that took the heavier elements that were created in nuclear furnaces of stars, they believe, and supernovas sent out the heavier elements into space. We ended up with a heavier element star or different population. They believe our sun is one of those other population stars and probably formed about 5 billion years ago. And there were molten masses that were orbiting our star, which now we call planets. Now, this is a very difficult one for them, because if this happened, all of the planets should be orbiting in the same direction, but that is not true. So they have come up with many theories. Maybe they were hit by meteors to change their direction, but still, somehow they believe that a molten blob that we call Earth was formed about 4.5 billion years ago. And then it began to cool. And once we get to it cooled down and with an atmosphere, somehow liquid water came to Earth, or the elements for it. This liquid water is very hard to explain. There are theories that maybe a meteorite carried the elements and hit the Earth. But we have a lot of liquid water here. But once you have water, we have to explain how life got here. For life, you need lipids, glucose, DNA, and proteins. How did they all come and to work together for life? Well, they don't know. Just like Ben Stein and his documentary called Expelled, he asked a question in an interview at the end to the atheist Richard Dawkins. And he says, what is the origin of life? And Richard Dawkins plainly stated, we don't have an idea and nobody knows. So somehow we have life here. And some self-replicating molecule. And they believe that this molecule, over a span of 3 to 4 billion years, after replicating, went through mutations and somehow got to sexual reproduction between male and female, and throughout this formed maybe like a tree of life where all plants, animals, and humans came out of this. So this is the model of origins that is the most popular one, at least, in the naturalistic worldview.
The amazing thing is that every atom in your body came from a star that exploded. And the atoms in your left hand probably came from a different star than your right hand. It really is the most poetic thing I know about physics. You are all stardust. You couldn't be here if stars hadn't exploded, because the elements, the carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, iron, all the things that matter for evolution weren't created at the beginning of time. They're created in the nuclear furnaces of stars, and the only way they can get into your body is if the stars were kind enough to explode. So forget Jesus. The stars died so that you could be here today. Okay? And anyway.
And so with this model, it is used as the scientific framework for interpreting the evidence that we see today. So the evidence is placed within this model, and then it is called science. But the problem is that, again, we are looking at origins. And once you put the evidence in this model, many people say if you argue with it, you are arguing against science. That is an incorrect way of explaining things. So let's look a little closely about where they believe biological life as we see it today came from. Charles Darwin made popular the idea of an evolutionary tree of life, to where, as I said before, all plants and animals have a descendant in common. And throughout the ages, it all branched out like a tree. So Darwin wasn't happy just expressing this model. He had to now look for evidence of transitionary forms, of leftovers from an evolutionary past of descendants in common descent. So that is where the idea came out that Darwin taught about, and then others after him expanded on vestigial organs or parts. So notice one example that is commonly given. Let's think of the whale. The whale, this huge sea mammal. The idea is that the whale first evolved out of water. And then when the whale came upon the earth, evolved into an earth-dwelling mammal. Something like today an opossum. In Spanish we call it a zarigüeya or a mapache. And this animal then went back to the water originally and evolved into a whale. And so the idea is a vestigial organ would be its back hind quarters, as you can see here, that those used to be feet that it used to walk on the earth. But now they are shrinking back without function because it is not using them in the water anymore. And humans, I'm sure you've heard of the appendix. Many say that the appendix's only function is to make the surgeons more rich. So it must be something left over from an evolutionary past. Another example is the coccyx, or the tailbone, and the base of our vertebrae. It is taught that this used to be a tail that our ancestors used to swing from the trees. But since we are now land dwelling and no longer on trees and standing up straight, that is what's left over of once what used to be a long tail. Also, I'm sure you've heard of wisdom teeth. Many say today that much has changed in our evolutionary past, so wisdom teeth must be part of an evolutionary past of humans that are not needed mostly anymore. Not only vestigials are used to teach evolution, also homology. What is homology? Homology is comparing different creatures and looking for patterns, different patterns in their anatomy that could suggest a common descent. Look at this example I've given you here. You have the human arm. If we go from top to bottom, he starts with one bone, then in the forearm, 2 bones, and then in the wrist, a group of bones, and then the digits or the fingers. But if you also see the cachorro, the dog, it also has a pattern that is very similar. 1 bone, 2, a union of bones, a group of bones, and then digits. Also, the bird and the whale. Do you see a common pattern? So the idea is a commonality of patterns in anatomy or homology should suggest that they have all these 4 creatures have an ancestor in common. Also, Ernst Haeckel published this idea that in the different phases of the embryos, whether it be human, a puppy, a bird, a salamander, etc., that they go through stages, embryonic stages, but we all start off almost the same. So this would look like a common descent. And then more recently, the headlines of a finding in genetics that the chimpanzee is almost human and humans are almost chimps in the genome. A 99% comparison of being equal in the DNA. Now, I will speak about this later, but I'm right now not going to answer some of these. I just want to give you the different lines of arguments given for this evolutionary model in naturalism. But before responding to this and seeing what the Bible teaches about origins, let's suppose this is true. What does that mean about what it means to be a human? The existential questions. If we really came from that, how can we answer why we are here? What is the meaning of life? Now, in a strictly naturalistic worldview, there is no objective category of meaning. It does not exist. And many evolutionists have come to understand that. I just spoke about embryos in the study by Ernst Haeckel. Let's see what he wrote to his Christian father about now how he tries to understand meaning because of what he now believes about our origins.
Parece-me que o indivíduo com sua existência normal é apenas membro temporário desta grande cadeia que, como vapor, rapidamente desaparece. A existência pessoal e individual me parece terrivelmente miserável, pequena, desprezível e, do meu ponto de vista, só que foi projetada para a destruição.
Now let me clarify. Not all evolutionists think this way. But for those who do not think this way, I would have to challenge, where do you then get your objective category for meaning? So, if we all came branching off of an evolutionary tree from ape-like creatures, then how do we know human worth, the meaning of life? Time Life Books, 1966, produced this image to explain our differences as humans with this idea of the formation of different biological races through evolutionary processes. And these ideas also contributed to a lot of problems, like in eugenics, the movement for forming superior races. They promoted the idea that you should not marry someone from a different race to keep the lighter skin race superior from not mixing. And there were different kinds of eugenics practices that came out of the theory of evolution. Number one, there were laws that were passed in the United States against marrying outside of your race. These were applied to interracial marriages and against people who had defects getting married. And this was to keep the pureness of the Caucasian race and limit the number of defectives. One of the major leaders of the eugenics movement later came out to be Margaret Sanger, the president of Planned Parenthood, who promotes abortion now. And look what she says about the human race.
A própria caridade organizada é o sintoma de uma doença social malévola. Nossa civilização gerou, e ainda está gerando, e está perpetuando grande número de seres defeituosos, delinquentes e dependentes que estão constantemente aumentando.
What were the ideas behind this? Well, let's go back a little bit in time to Francis Galton. Francis Galton was a cousin of Charles Darwin. And Francis Galton and Charles Darwin would write letters back and forth between each other. Francis Galton took the theory of evolution from his cousin and wanted to apply it to a social evolution. If we have all evolved like animals, then there must be more superior races of people, just like there are superior races of animals. And so Francis Galton ended up being the father of the modern eugenics movement. And himself, he said that the creed of eugenics is based on the idea of evolution. And then Charles Darwin, around this same time, wrote his work on the origin of the species in 1859. And in 1871, Charles Darwin wrote The Descent of Man. In The Descent of Man, Charles Darwin taught that there are different biological races of humans, and that the most civilized ones, the highest ones, are the Caucasians. That the lower human races, according to him, were closer to the apes than to the Caucasians. And this is all in this book till today, The Descent of Man. Now, there are different racial groups, principal racial groups that were taught. The most common were the Caucasoide, Mongoloide, Negroide, and the Australoide. And these ideas came all the way to the West, to the New World as well, and were taught in many schools. Let me give you an example. A civic biology book in the United States took these ideas, and one of the textbooks says the following.
Existem atualmente 5 raças na Terra. A melhor classe de todas é a raça branca, representada pelos habitantes brancos civilizados da Europa e dos Estados Unidos.
Now, I think I need to clarify this again. Number one, that not all evolutionists are racist. But if they are not racist, according to what worldview do they believe that you shouldn't be a racist? If man is created in God's image, then there is no room for racism. There are no inferior or superior groups. So we need to really think about this on a foundational level. Okay? Now, about the supposed races, when we get to the next to last talk in this series, I will go much deeper into this. Also, if we are just evolved stardust, then really, what is the meaning of life? What are we here for? In an interview with the atheist Richard Dawkins, the question was posed to him, and it was this.
Devido à ideia de evolução e seleção natural, algumas pessoas acham que tudo não tem sentido, tanto a vida dos indivíduos quanto a vida em geral.
And his answer was this. Look at this.
Se é verdade que alguns se desesperam, então que azar você é. Se for verdade, é a verdade e é melhor você aprender a conviver com isso.
Now, not all atheists are as pessimistic as Richard Dawkins. His own foundation has different writers, and one of them is a little bit more optimistic. Gleb Taberski says the following.
O que? Você diz que a ciência não pode responder às grandes questões da vida e que isso é obra de dogmas religiosos, certo? Bem, uma onda recente de pesquisas em psicologia, neurociência cognitiva e outras disciplinas explorou como descobrimos o significado e o propósito da vida, com ou sem a crença em uma divindade. Portanto, nós, como pessoas seculares, podemos usar a ciência para preencher aquele vazio profundo na boca do estômago que vem da falta de um senso pessoal de significado e propósito. Podemos usar a ciência para responder à pergunta: qual é o significado da vida para você?
So, Gleb thinks he's answering a question with a more optimistic result, but I think he messed up here. He started using categories that do not exist in his worldview, and also, how could he have a feeling of no purpose and meaning in his life? That category shouldn't exist if naturalistic evolution were to be true. Do you remember C.S. Lewis, who wrote Narnia? Well, C.S. Lewis responded before Gleb's time to his atheism from the past. Remember, C.S. Lewis used to be an atheist, and he was part of a group at Oxford called the Inklings of Writers, and one person who was in that group, too, was a professor at Oxford named J.R. Tolkien, the author of The Lord of the Rings. Now, many believe that C.S. Lewis was also a professor at Oxford, but he was not. He was a lecturer. He never made the level of professor. But C.S. Lewis would talk, and in one night, C.S. Lewis, it seems that he had a conversion to Christ. And him looking back on naturalism, look what he says about people like Gleb, even though Gleb lives much later than C.S. Lewis.
Se todo o universo não tem sentido, significado, propósito, nunca teríamos descoberto que ele não tem sentido, da mesma forma. Se não houvesse luz no universo e segue-se naturalmente que não havia criaturas com olhos, nunca deveríamos saber que está escuro, a própria escuridão não teria sentido.
And I think that's very true. In a random universe made by accidental processes, we should never be looking for a purpose, because it is a category, even on a subjective sense, because it is a category that does not exist, if that is to be true. So now let's see the third question. Remember, we are assuming atheism right now, and naturalistic, materialistic atheism. So we just saw their answer to origins, now meaning. Let's look at morality. What should we do? What is the ethic in an atheistic worldview? Now, it's hard to answer this question without provoking misunderstanding. So what I first want to do is ask you a few questions. And I want you to really, really think these through. First question. Can a strictly naturalistic person be a moral person? Now remember, can an atheist be a good person? That's the question. Now think about how you would respond to that. Well, in theory, yes. But now why do I say in theory? Because we know the Bible teaches that nobody is good. We are all sinners. None of us reach the level of the glory of God in holiness. So we have all fallen short. So you can, when speaking about if somebody can be a good person, we have to speak in theory, because in practice nobody is. But in theory, yes. But here's the problem with that. According to naturalism and this survival of the fittest, why should they live a moral life? And here we don't have any good answer that I've heard yet. But anyway, who decides what good and bad is in a naturalistic, atheistic worldview? We already saw this. For there to exist evil, there has to exist good, because evil is just a perversion of good. But there has to be a universal moral law to distinguish between the two, or it becomes ambiguous, and once you get there, we're back to the beginning again. But there to be a universal moral law, there has to be a giver to that moral law. So if you do not believe in a creator, then you cannot have a universal moral law. So there can be no good, and then there could be no evil. So things change. What's good and bad changes to what's natural. In a naturalistic worldview, they fight for and promote what is natural, not what is good or evil. Now, this was predicted actually beforehand by an atheist. It was Friedrich Nietzsche in the 19th century. He is the one who coined the term God is dead. And in his poem, which is called The Madman, I'm just going to show you a couple parts of it, what he said. And I want you to really think about what this means.
Onde está Deus? Ele exclamou. Eu vou te dizer. Nós o matamos, você e eu somos todos assassinos. Não estamos caindo em uma queda constante, para trás, para os lados, para a frente. Em todas as direções, ainda existe sobe e desce, não estamos vagando como se por nada infinito.
So what he is poetically saying is that if God dies philosophically, on a philosophical level, then we're going to not know what's up or down anymore because we won't have an objective moral law. And he says this as an atheist. So Dr. Phil Fernandez, what he said is very true, making a summary about what Nietzsche taught.
Nietzsche previu que o homem do século XX amadureceria. Com isso ele quis dizer que o ateu do século XX perceberia as consequências de viver em mundo sem Deus. Porque sem Deus não há valores morais absolutos. O homem é livre para brincar de Deus e criar sua própria moralidade, por causa disso. Nietzsche profetizou que o século XX seria o mais sangrento da história da humanidade.
And Nietzsche was right. In the 20th century, we had 123 million deaths in war and genocide. And that is more than the sum of the previous 1900 years combined. So we have lost any moral compass today. And did you know that even Hitler took Nietzsche's writings and to Mussolini to justify the purification of an Aryan race against the Jews? Now, let's think about this. Nancy Pearcey, in her book, Total Truth, calls this kind of materialistic atheism that we've seen here like in a two-story house. And the first story are called cold facts. But we can't leave it there, because if you take away objective meaning, objective morality, well then also now you have to come up with a new way of understanding some of the existential questions of time. And that's where we got relativism. I don't know if you have this saying in Brazil, but relativism in Spanish is promoted through the saying, every head is a world. In other words, what's your truth and what my truth is can be different according to the world inside our own head. There is no absolute truth in postmodernism or relativism. All truth is relative, and morality, therefore, is relative. And that's why we're seeing these social movements today with a relative morality. So let's think about this for a minute. Number one, the premise that says there are no absolute truths. In many universities, students or professors say that to me. And I usually respond, how do you know that? If there are no absolute truths, then your premise that there is no absolute truths cannot be absolutely true either. So that is a contradiction right there. To say there are no absolute truths, that is an absolute premise. That's an absolute negation. That's why I believe that our relativistic friends have now modified this. And what I hear more common today is the second one. Well, there may be absolute truths, but if there are absolute truths, we could never know them. And then I respond, then how did you come to know that yourself? If we can never know absolute truths, then how did you come to know that we could never know absolute truths? You see, these are self-defeating terms, but they are used to push moral relativism. So let's also consider naturalism here. Strict naturalism that only matter exists? Well, then what part of matter is a thought made out of? What on the table of elements? Also, the laws of logic. What are they made out of? And also, why do we believe that they don't change? Why do we believe today, even in a debate, that the rules of logic apply to both of us? They are not matter or material. What about even very important categories like honor, virtue? If in a materialistic world, those can exist objectively. And even on a subjective level, they don't exist. It would just be pragmatism. What about art and music, which are both in the category of beauty? What makes something beautiful? And many people try to say, well, beauty in the creation or in nature is just for reproduction and survival of the fittest. But that is not true. A few have put it over 94% of all beauty in the natural world do not have any benefit for reproduction or for survival. We have an over design. And that's why Professor John Maynard Smith, evolutionary theorist, fellow Royal Society, and also he has won the Darwin Medal. He said that no topic in biology, evolutionary biology, presents greater problems than beauty.
Nenhum tópico da biologia evolutiva apresentou maiores dificuldades para os teóricos do que a beleza.
Also, in January 9, 2019, the New York Times Magazine published this article, How Beauty is Making Scientists Rethink Evolution. The extravagant splendor of the animal kingdom cannot be explained by natural selection alone, so how did it come to be? This is their wording. I'm only quoting what they say. So, as we look at these, that's just looking at beauty. But what about the other topics of thoughts, logic, honor, virtue? And, we have to be very careful about that. That's why C.S. Lewis also said this about that.
Se eu acreditar nesses homens, eles me dirão que a matemática é real, e então meu cérebro é real, a comida é real e, consequentemente, meu estômago é real. Mas eles me dizem que minhas emoções não têm nada a ver com a realidade. Eles vão produzir uma geração de homens com cérebro, homens com estômagos, homens sem peito e sem coração. Fazemos homens sem peito e esperamos deles virtude e responsabilidade conjunta. Zombamos da honra, mas ainda estamos surpresos ao descobrir que existem traidores entre nós.
So now let's see the last one. We saw origins, meaning, morality, and destiny. So let's look at destiny now, the last one. What is the future? What is the end of all that is happening in a naturalistic, atheistic worldview? Well, that brings us back to the Big Bang model. And cosmic inflation, or the Big Bang model, remember, you had the expansion of quantum singularity over billions of years. And what waits in the future is called heat death. Heat death is when all of the usable energy is run down and the universe can no longer support life. So we are really going towards a nothingness in this model. So the destiny is really just the decomposition of the elements that make you and me, and that is the end. And you know, that's why Dawkins said what he said earlier, that don't believe you're going to live again. So just enjoy life now and forget it. That is called hedonism. And hedonism did not begin with Dawkins. It did not even begin with the Greeks. Hedonism comes from the Garden of Eden, where you can be like God. You can, just do what's pleasing to you. Don't worry about what God's word said. And another ex-atheist, Malcolm Muggeridge, looks back on this, and he says our societies are destroying themselves. And note what he said.
Portanto, a conclusão final certamente seria que, enquanto outras civilizações foram derrubadas por ataques bárbaros vindos de fora, a nossa teve a distinção única de treinar seus próprios destruidores em suas próprias instituições educacionais e, em seguida, facilitar-lhes o que eles precisam para espalhar amplamente suas ideologias destrutivas, tudo no comando do Estado. Assim, o homem ocidental decidiu-se abolir a si mesmo, criando seu próprio tédio por sua própria abundância, sua própria vulnerabilidade por sua própria força, seu próprio desamparo de sua própria erotomania, soprando ele mesmo a trombeta que causou o colapso das muralhas de sua cidade, e tendo-se convencido de que era muito numerosa, ele trabalhou com uma pílula, um bisturi e uma seringa para diminuir a si mesmo. Até que, finalmente, tendo-se educado ao ponto da estupidez e se contaminado e se drogado para ficar estupefato, ele desabou, um velho brontossauro cansado e maltratado, e foi extinto.
So it is very scary to know where we are moving to as a Western society on answering these questions and finding a way to bring them together to answer the existential questions of life. So that brings us really to the Bible. How does the Word of God answer the existential questions of life? And that's why I want to introduce to you the 7 C's of history: creation, corruption, catastrophe, confusion, Christ, cross, consummation. Creation, God created, and everything was good. Eternal, non-material, God, who does not need a cause. He is the uncaused cause, who is necessary and eternal, who started the cause and effect relationship between himself and his creation in time. Corruption is the entrance of sin and death and suffering because of man's sin. Catastrophe is the flood. Confusion is the separation at the Tower of Babel, forming the different people groups who started the major migrations. Christ, God the Son, became flesh. Cross, he took upon the corruption of his people on himself, and then he rose from the dead. And then consummation, our eschatological hope for new heavens and new earth. Someday, God's saying very good again. So let's look closely into this. A lot closer. So what does the Bible say about the first question of origins? Where we came from? And that brings us to creation. Genesis 1:1 says, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." And if we go to Psalm 19:1, the psalmist says,
Os céus manifestam a glória de Deus e o firmamento, expansão, anuncia a obra de suas mãos.
so that word, firmamentum, is from the Latin Vulgate, from 405 after Christ, when Jerome did his life work masterpiece of giving the Latin translation of the Bible, which would end up being the official translation of Rome for 1,000 years. But he saw the word rakia in Hebrew and its Greek translation, and the Greek translation was stereoma, which means a hard crystal ball, because that was what the Greeks thought of cosmology. And then, so he used the word firmamentum, firme, duro, hard. So the better translation for that is most likely expansion, which is its use in most translations in Genesis 1, when God created the expanse of the heavens. That's the same word, rakia, which is expansion. So, how is it that the heavens declare the glory of God? How do they announce if the heavens do not have a mouth? You may say, well, Joe, that's just poetic. Well, the Psalms are very poetic, but we cannot miss what this is saying here, because the Psalm 33, 6 and 9 also says,
Pela palavra do Senhor foram feitos os céus, e todo o exército deles, pelo espírito da sua boca, porque falou, e tudo se fez, mandou, e logo tudo apareceu.
So let's think about this for a minute. Since everything was created by the Word of God, and we know this in Genesis 1, and God said, "Let there be light." So somehow the creation reflects that creative Word of God and lets us know some things about God. That's why Paul said in Romans 1,
Porque do céu se manifesta a ira de Deus sobre toda a impiedade e injustiça dos homens que detêm a verdade em injustiça, porquanto o que de Deus se pode conhecer nele se manifesta. Porque Deus lhe o manifestou, porque as suas coisas invisíveis, desde a criação do mundo, tanto o seu eterno poder como a sua divindade, se entendem e claramente se veem pelas coisas que estão criadas, para que eles fiquem inexcusáveis.
so God reveals enough about himself in creation and his glory in creation that man is without excuse. So looking again at Psalm 19:1, how the glory of God is manifest or spoke through the heavens, and also through the expanse announces the work of his hands. I want us to kind of do an exercise together. I want to show you a few things about space, and let's think about what of the glory of the creator of all this we can see. So I want to first show you a picture that was taken by the Hubble. Now, this picture is taken after many hours of exposure, a camera pointing to the darkest part of outer space, where looks like there's absolutely nothing. And this is the image that came out of what looks like absolutely nothing. Now, every spot you see here is not a star. It is a galaxy. So our own galaxy has billions of stars. So imagine the stars in each one of these galaxies. This shows the handiwork of an awesome, awesome creator God who is full of glory. Now, let's take a little trip in space together. So what I want to do is show you a simulation of what many astronomers believe to be what on the outside of the known universe must look like. And then from there, let's take a trip all the way to Brazil. Now, to understand distances, every time you see a circle, we have traveled 90% of the remaining distance home. We will take a few stops to look at some of creation, and I pray that you can be thinking and meditating in your heart as we watch this. The heavens declare the glory of God.
Quando contemplo os teus céus, a obra dos teus dedos, e a lua e as estrelas que estabeleceste, que é o homem que dele te lembres, e o filho do homem que o visites. Agora viajaremos de volta para casa, ampliando por um fator de 10 a cada 4 segundos. O pequeno círculo é 10 vezes menor que o grande. Cada vez que vemos um novo círculo, percorremos 90% da distância restante para casa. As faixas e vazios das galáxias parecem desaparecer à medida que nos aproximamos da Terra. Nós mergulhamos nas dezenas de galáxias mais próximas, chamadas de grupo local. Finalmente, a Via Láctea está visível.
So our first stop is the Via Láctea. In English, it's called the Milky Way. This is our galaxy. Our galaxy has over 200 billion stars. And our sun is not even visible from here. It's between two of those arms, spiral arms. And we have a lot of evidence that points to the fact that in the middle of our spiral galaxy, we have a black hole, a supermassive black hole. Now, let me explain something, because I'm sure you have seen the pictures of a black hole that have come out in the last few years. But I want to explain to you what it is you are seeing in that image. A black hole is a point, a very massive point, many times more mass than our sun. But this point does not take up any space. It's very difficult to understand. Well, the black hole has so much mass that its gravitational pull does not let light escape from it. So the hole that you see, the round hole, is not the black hole. That's called the horizon. From that point inward, light cannot escape because of the black hole that's in there somewhere. And then on the outside of this hole, you see a red disk. That is called an accretion disk. This disk pulls in material, like in this binary system here, and that material speeds up as it goes into the black hole. And then a jet is shot from the top and bottom. Well, this is just a simulation that you're seeing here. But now, I don't know if you remember, about 2 or 3 years ago, this picture that was uploaded saying that we have the first image of a black hole. And then this year, we got a better image of it. But let's think about this for a minute. You're really not seeing a black hole. You're seeing the circle in the middle. The black circle is the horizon boundary. And then the red disk around it is the accretion disk. Okay? Something really interesting about black holes is that space and time bend around it. And so time becomes something very interesting as you get close to the horizon. Now, if you've ever looked outside at night without clouds and seen something that looks like a cloud, like a band going across, you are probably looking into the center of our galaxy. Think of a round plate. And that's like the spiral galaxy. We are between two of those arms. Now, if you put that plate sideways, it's just going to look like a band. And that is what you're seeing there. Well, let's continue our trip and continue to think the heavens declare the glory of God.
Estamos nos aproximando da nossa galáxia, quase que diretamente de cima. Entramos na Via Láctea entre dois de seus braços espirais. Agora podemos ver que esses braços consistem de bilhões de estrelas. Aproximando-se do nosso sistema solar, as estrelas diminuem a velocidade e convergem às suas posições conhecidas. Fazemos uma pausa para observar que agora podemos reconhecer as constelações. Órion está visível à nossa esquerda. O Sol está bem à frente, mas dessa distância ele parece apenas uma estrela tênue. Por fim, chegamos ao sistema solar. As órbitas dos planetas externos são destacadas. Agora podemos ver as órbitas dos planetas internos, mas a Terra ainda é invisível dessa distância. A Terra pode parecer um cisco insignificante em comparação a tudo que Deus criou. No entanto, este pequeno mundo é onde Deus colocou as joias que adornam sua criação. De tudo que foi criado pelo Senhor, apenas o ser humano tem o privilégio de ter sido criado à imagem de Deus.
Look at planet Earth. How would it be to see it from here? Well, I've never seen it from here personally, but I have a friend who has. His name is Barry Wilmore. Barry does a few conferences with me every year. I hope someday to have him in Brazil. He is an active astronaut, and this September, Lord willing, will be the pilot of the first manned Boeing Starliner crew to go up to the International Space Station. He has been commander of the space station in prior trips, and he speaks wonders about what he sees up there. And he uses that to give a defense of the glory of God in creation. But let's go even more micro now.
Sido criado à imagem de Deus.
There are so many things we could see about planet Earth. Let's just look at the cell. The cell is so complex. We started from the outside of the known universe, and now we're looking at one cell. What I want to show you here are just the metabolical pathways inside one cell. That is more complex than some towns. But when we look in the DNA, at the DNA of a cell, there are two compartments that have DNA. The mitochondria, which is an energy factory of the cell, and the nucleus. In the mitochondria, the DNA is only from your mother. But in the nucleus, half is from your mom and half is from your dad. And in the nucleus, the DNA is made up of 3 billion chemical letters. And it works kind of like a manual, an instructions manual. Let's see what instruction manuals do in our technology to make vehicles. But DNA is much more complex. The DNA makes a kind of copy of itself called RNA. The RNA comes out of a perfectly designed orifice of the nucleus of the cell, taking all of that information, and then it is read by mechanisms 3 letters at a time, and it's instructing it to put certain types of amino acids in a certain order to make proteins. But doing a comparison between DNA and how to manufacture a car isn't a fair comparison, because I have never seen a car have a baby car in the middle of the road, because our technology, we can't get to this point of self-replication. Wouldn't it be nice if your car, when it gets older, makes a baby car? But the DNA does have self-replication. Now, one strand of the DNA is read in one direction. The other strand of DNA is read in the opposite direction. So to make a copy, you have to separate the strands. One of them needs to be copied straight and the other one needs to be copied backwards. And we see this happening here and this happens around 10,000 revolutions per minute. That is probably 3 times faster than the rotation of your car engine when you rode it last. It's very fast. Also, think about this. These 3 billion letters can be read in both directions. Depending on what direction you read, it'll either tell you about how to code for proteins. The other direction will probably tell you to regulate when and when not to. So it is very complex. Now, how do you fit all of that information inside the nucleus of a cell? Well, all of that information is on a 2-meter long strand. So how could you fit 2 meters of a DNA strand in the nucleus, microscopic nucleus of a cell? Well, there are proteins that do that, and they wrap it like if it was dental floss. So you need proteins for DNA to function, but you also need DNA functioning to make proteins. So which one came first? But that is just on a micro level. Let's go a little macro. We can't even explain where life came from. Remember what I just showed you? about what is the origin of life, and Dawkins said we have no idea. But let's go up on a macro level. What about the life forms like animals today? Well, remember what we saw about the vestigial organs? Well, this isn't so. Remember about the whale? Those hindquarters are not evolutionary leftovers without function. The whales use them in the slippery water for reproduction to latch on to the other whale in the water for reproduction. Also, the appendix has many functions. Not only do we now know that it has very important functions in the immune system, especially in youth. Just a year or 2 years ago, I read an article that explained that that we're discovering even newer functions. So the appendix has many functions. Somebody may say, but you can live without it. And my answer is yes. But also, if somebody cuts your hand off, you can live without your hand also. But does that mean that the hand has no function because you can live without it? Of course not. What about the coccyx, the tailbone? Well, this is not an evolutionary leftover. This is a very important place of connection that helps you, especially even to use the restroom. What about the wisdom teeth? Well, let's see what Dr. James Trexel, dentist, says about that.
Observamos traços de desgaste e mandíbulas maiores não apenas em pessoas que viverão antes do século XVIII, mas também em certas subpopulações modernas que ainda dependem de uma dieta não moderna para seu sustento diário, nestes grupos de pessoas. Também existe uma forte correlação com os dentes do siso funcionais e a redução da impactação. Por exemplo, os pesquisadores descobriram que os nigerianos rurais tiveram uma taxa de impacto muito menor de seus dentes do siso 1,1% do que seus colegas urbanos 10,7%. Enquanto observavam a dieta fibrosa e desgaste muito pronunciado observado nos nigerianos rurais.
So what he's saying is that the reason some people have problems with wisdom teeth, it is because we have changed our diet. In our modern diet, we do not have to chew hard, and that causes two problems. Number one, in your youth, your jaw grows in accordance to its use. If you only eat processed food that does not require hard biting, your jaw does not grow to its full potential. So we have a smaller jaw because we're eating processed foods. But also, when you eat foods that are not processed, the top of the teeth are filed down some. And since our teeth are like this, if you're not filing the top down, then our teeth are wider. So a smaller jaw, wider teeth, sometimes some people, they have problems that the wisdom teeth to fit when they came out. That's not evolution. That's just a change of diet and the potential of jaw size and teeth use. What about the embryos, the different stages of embryo development? Well, this was a fraud. Notice that the embryologist, Dr. Michael Richardson, in his interview with the Times of London, what he says.
Este é dos piores casos de fraude científica. É chocante descobrir que alguém que você pensava ser grande cientista estava deliberadamente enganando. Isso me deixa com raiva. O que salamandra, o porco e todos os outros pareciam iguais no mesmo estágio de desenvolvimento, mas não é verdade. Estas são falsificações.
So here is Ernst Haeckel's different first phase embryos of fish, salamander, tortoise, of chicken, of a rabbit, and human. Almost all the same. This is what this embryologist took of the pictures today. They look all very different. This was a fraud. This was a copy. And do you remember the chimpanzee DNA? Well, the problem is that they only compared certain portions of the DNA. Now doing a closer examination of more of the DNA, we are at about a 12% difference now. And that is about 400 million base pair differences between the chimpanzee and the human at their DNA level. That is like a library full of information in every cell between the human and the chimpanzee. Well, what about homology? Yes, a good design is to be used by the same creator for extremities. Think of cars made in Europe, cars made in America, North America, and in Asia. These manufacturers, they're on different continents, but they put the lights in the front, the wheels on the side, and underneath, the doors on the side. Well, since they have same design patterns, should we say that somewhere over the Arctic, where the three continents can be pointed together, that there used to be a manufacturer millions of years ago that separated to make these three? No. That just means it's a good design. Just in art, Diego Rivera is a Mexican muralist of the past. In his different paintings, there are many colors and shapes and designs and patterns that are very similar. Does that mean that there was a painting millions of years ago that separated out through natural processes to make three paintings? Or does that mean there is a designer in common? That is a designer in common.